Kindly hit the subscribe button to see more of our revengeful and emotional stories. Thank you. What if I told you that the doctor you trust with your life might be getting paid to keep you sick? That every prescription, every diagnosis, every treatment plan could be motivated not by your health, but by how much money it puts in their pocket? My name is Martha Thompson, and for 5 years, I lived this nightmare. I trusted a doctor who was literally being paid to destroy my life. But when I discovered the truth, I made sure he paid a price he'll never forget. This is the story of how I exposed a medical conspiracy that went deeper than I ever imagined, and how I got my revenge on the man who stole 5 years of my life. If you think this could never happen to you, think again. By the end of this story, you'll never look at your doctor the same way again. The marble floors of the Hartwell Medical Center gleamed under crystal chandeliers as I walked through the lobby for my first appointment. Everything about Dr. Marcus Hartwell's practice screamed success and competence, from the mahogany-paneled waiting room to the diplomas covering his office walls. Johns Hopkins Medical School, Harvard residency, board certifications in internal medicine and rheumatology. This was exactly the kind of doctor I needed. At 28, I had been experiencing symptoms that were turning my life upside down. The chronic fatigue hit me like a freight train every afternoon, leaving me unable to concentrate during important client meetings at the marketing firm where I worked. My joints ached constantly, especially my knees and wrists, making simple tasks like typing or walking upstairs feel like torture. Most disturbing of all was the cognitive fog that seemed to cloud my thoughts, making me forget words mid-sentence and struggle with tasks that had once been effortless. My primary care physician had run basic blood work that came back normal, then referred me to Dr. Hartwell with a shrug and a suggestion that it might be stress. But I knew my body, and this wasn't stress. This was something real, something serious, and I needed answers. Dr. Hartwell entered the examination room with the confidence of a man who had never doubted himself. Tall and distinguished, with silver hair and an expensive suit, he looked like he'd stepped out of a medical drama. His handshake was firm, his smile warm, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of decades of medical training. "Ms. Thompson," he said, settling into his chair with my file open before him. "I've reviewed your symptoms and your primary care physician's notes. Tell me, how long have you been experiencing these issues?" I launched into my story, describing the gradual onset of symptoms over the past 6 months, how they'd progressively worsened, and how they were affecting every aspect of my life. Dr. Hartwell listened intently, occasionally nodding and making notes. He asked detailed questions about my sleep patterns, stress levels, and family medical history. "Based on what you're telling me," he said after a thorough examination, "I believe you're dealing with fibromyalgia. It's a complex condition that affects the way your brain processes pain signals, leading to widespread pain, fatigue, and cognitive difficulties, what we call fibrofog." The diagnosis felt both relieving and terrifying. Relieving because finally someone was taking my symptoms seriously and giving them a name. Terrifying because I'd heard of fibromyalgia, a chronic condition with no cure, often dismissed by doctors and misunderstood by family and friends. "The good news," Dr. Hartwell continued, "is that while fibromyalgia can't be cured, it can be managed effectively with the right treatment approach. I'm going to start you on a comprehensive regimen that should help significantly with your symptoms." He prescribed 3 medications: Lyrica for the nerve pain, Cymbalta for the depression and pain that often accompany fibromyalgia, and Tramadol for breakthrough pain. He also recommended a low-dose muscle relaxer for sleep and suggested I begin seeing a physical therapist who specialized in fibromyalgia. "I want to see you back in 4 weeks, he said, handing me the prescriptions. "These medications can take time to reach therapeutic levels, so don't be discouraged if you don't see immediate improvement. Fibromyalgia is a marathon, not a sprint." Walking out of his office, I felt hopeful for the first time in months. Finally, I had a diagnosis and a treatment plan. Dr. Hartwell seemed knowledgeable and caring, and his confidence was infectious. I trusted him completely. That trust would prove to be the biggest mistake of my life. The first few weeks on Dr. Hartwell's prescribed medications were a roller coaster of side effects and false hopes. The Lyrica made me dizzy and caused significant weight gain, 15 pounds in the first month alone. The Cymbalta left me feeling emotionally numb, as if I was experiencing life through a thick fog. The Tramadol provided some pain relief, but made me constipated and gave me headaches. When I returned for my follow-up appointment, I was honest about the side effects I was experiencing. Dr. Hartwell listened with apparent concern, then adjusted my dosages and added another medication to counteract the side effects. "This is completely normal," he assured me. "Finding the right combination of medications for fibromyalgia often requires some trial and error. Your body is adjusting to the treatments, and we need to be patient with the process." He prescribed gabapentin to replace the Lyrica, hoping it would cause fewer side effects, and added a prescription sleep aid to help with the insomnia that had developed. He also suggested I try a newer medication called Savella, which he described as specifically designed for fibromyalgia patients. "I've been having excellent results with Savella in my practice," he said, writing out the prescription. "It's one of the newer fibromyalgia medications, and many of my patients have seen significant improvement." The Savella was expensive. Even with insurance, my copay was $200 per month. But Dr. Hartwell seemed confident it would help, and I was desperate for relief. My work performance was suffering due to the cognitive fog and fatigue, and my supervisor had already expressed concerns about my frequent absences and decreased productivity. Over the next several months, my medication regimen continued to expand. When the gabapentin caused memory problems, Dr. Hartwell switched me to a newer anticonvulsant. When that caused mood swings, he added an antipsychotic medication at a low dose. When I developed digestive issues, he prescribed medications to manage those symptoms as well. Each appointment followed the same pattern. I would report new symptoms or side effects, and Dr. Hartwell would adjust dosages or add new medications. He always had a logical explanation for why these adjustments were necessary, and he consistently reassured me that we were making progress, even when I felt worse than ever. "Fibromyalgia is a complex condition," he would say. "It affects multiple systems in the body, which is why we need a multifaceted approach to treatment. Some patients require more medications than others to achieve symptom control." By the end of my first year under Dr. Hartwell's care, I was taking 8 different medications daily. My monthly pharmacy bills exceeded $800, even with insurance coverage. I had gained 30 pounds, developed chronic digestive issues, and was experiencing mood swings that strained my relationships with friends and family. Most concerning of all, my original symptoms hadn't improved. If anything, they had worsened. The fatigue was more severe, the joint pain more widespread, and the cognitive fog so thick that I struggled to complete basic tasks at work. I felt like I was drowning in my own body, unable to function as the person I had once been. When I expressed these concerns to Dr. Hartwell, he remained optimistic and encouraging. "Fibromyalgia can be stubborn," he explained. "Some patients take longer to respond to treatment than others. The important thing is that we don't give up." I've seen patients who struggled for years before finding the right combination of treatments that worked for them. He suggested adding a low-dose opioid medication for the severe pain days and recommended I try a series of trigger point injections in his office. The injections were expensive and not covered by insurance, but Dr. Hartwell assured me they could provide significant relief for fibromyalgia patients. I agreed to the injections, desperate for any relief from the constant pain and fatigue that had taken over my life. The procedures were painful and provided only temporary relief, but Dr. Hartwell recommended continuing them monthly, insisting that the cumulative effect would be beneficial. As my second year of treatment began, I started to feel like a prisoner in my own body. The medications made me feel disconnected from myself and the world around me. I had lost my job due to my inability to perform at my previous level, and I was burning through my savings to pay for the expensive treatments and medications. My family and friends were supportive, but increasingly concerned. They watched as I transformed from a vibrant, successful young woman into someone who could barely function day to day. Some gently suggested I might want to seek a second opinion, but I dismissed their concerns. Dr. Hartwell was a respected specialist with impressive credentials. If he couldn't help me, who could? That blind faith in his expertise was exactly what he was counting on. By the beginning of my third year under Dr. Hartwell's care, my life had become unrecognizable. I spent most days in bed, too exhausted and pain-ridden to engage in activities I had once loved. My social circle had shrunk as friends grew tired of canceled plans and my inability to participate in normal activities. The medications had caused significant weight gain, hair loss, and skin problems that made me feel self-conscious and unattractive. Dr. Hartwell's treatment approach had evolved into what felt like an endless cycle of medication adjustments and additions. Every few months, he would introduce a new drug, often describing it as a breakthrough treatment for fibromyalgia or a medication that had shown promising results in his practice. "I've been following the research closely," he would say, pulling out medical journals and studies to support his recommendations. "There are some exciting new developments in fibromyalgia treatment, and I want to make sure you have access to the most advanced therapies available." The newest addition to my regimen was a medication called Nucynta, an expensive opioid that Dr. Hartwell described as specifically designed for chronic pain conditions like fibromyalgia. The monthly cost was staggering, over $400 even with insurance, but he assured me it could be a game changer for my pain management. "Nucynta works differently than traditional opioids," he explained. "It has a dual mechanism of action that makes it particularly effective for neuropathic pain, which is a significant component of fibromyalgia. Many of my patients have seen remarkable improvement with this medication." I was also receiving monthly injections of a medication called rituximab, which Dr. Hartwell described as an innovative treatment for autoimmune components of fibromyalgia. Each injection cost $3,000, and while my insurance covered most of it, my copay was still $300 per month. The injections required me to spend half a day in Dr. Hartwell's infusion center, connected to N4 while the medications slowly dripped into my system. The financial strain was becoming overwhelming. I had exhausted my savings and was relying on credit cards to pay for treatments. My monthly medical expenses exceeded $2,000, and I was no longer able to work due to the severity of my symptoms and the side effects of the medications. When I expressed concern about the costs, Dr. Hartwell was sympathetic but firm in his recommendations. "I understand the financial burden is significant," he said, "but we're treating a serious chronic condition that could affect you for the rest of your life. The cost of not treating fibromyalgia aggressively can be much higher in the long run: lost productivity, disability, decreased quality of life. These treatments are an investment in your future health and well-being." He also connected me with pharmaceutical company patient assistance programs that could help offset some of the costs. Representatives from various drug companies would call me regularly to check on my experience with their medications and offer additional financial support. At the time, I was grateful for their concern and assistance. I didn't realize that these programs were part of a larger strategy to keep patients on expensive medications regardless of their effectiveness. Dr. Hartwell's office had also expanded significantly during my time as his patient. He had hired additional staff, moved to a larger facility, and added new services like the infusion center and an on-site pharmacy. His waiting room was always full of patients who looked as sick and defeated as I felt, many of them clutching pill organizers and discussing their complex medication regimens. During one appointment, I mentioned that I had been reading about fibromyalgia online and had come across information about alternative treatments like dietary changes, exercise therapy, and stress reduction techniques. Some patients reported significant improvement with these approaches, and I wondered if we might try incorporating some of these strategies into my treatment plan. Dr. Hartwell's response was swift and dismissive. "I appreciate your interest in researching your condition," he said, "but I need to caution you about the information you find online. Much of it is anecdotal and not based on rigorous scientific evidence. Fibromyalgia is a complex neurological condition that requires pharmaceutical intervention. Diet and exercise can be helpful adjuncts to treatment, but they're not sufficient on their own to manage a condition of this severity." He went on to explain that my case was particularly complex and severe, requiring the aggressive treatment approach we had been pursuing. He warned me that reducing or discontinuing medications could lead to a significant worsening of my symptoms and potentially irreversible damage. "I've been treating fibromyalgia for over 20 years, he said. "I've seen what happens when patients try to manage this condition with lifestyle changes alone. The results are rarely successful, and patients often end up in much worse condition than when they started." His confidence and expertise were reassuring, but a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I was taking more medications than ever, spending more money than ever, and feeling worse than ever. The logical part of my mind wondered if there might be a connection between these facts, but I pushed those doubts aside. Dr. Hartwell was the expert, and I was just a patient struggling to understand, recognized the person staring back at me. The financial devastation was complete. I had maxed out multiple credit cards paying for treatments and medications, and I was facing bankruptcy. My small apartment was cluttered with medical supplies and equipment, and I had sold most of my possessions to pay for Dr. Hartwell's treatments. The patient assistance programs helped with some costs, but the copays and uncovered expenses still exceeded my disability income by hundreds of dollars each month. Most heartbreaking of all was the toll on my relationships. My family had grown frustrated with my constant illness and inability to participate in family gatherings and celebrations. Friends had stopped calling, tired of my cancellations and my inability to engage in normal social activities. I had become isolated and alone, with only my monthly appointments with Dr. Hartwell providing any human contact. During one particularly difficult appointment, I broke down completely in Dr. Hartwell's office. The weight of 4 years of suffering, financial ruin, and social isolation crashed over me like a tsunami. I sobbed uncontrollably, telling him that I couldn't continue living this way, that the treatments weren't working, and that I felt like I was dying slowly. Dr. Hartwell handed me tissues and waited patiently for my tears to subside. When I finally composed myself enough to speak, he leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Martha, I can see how much you're struggling, and I want you to know that your feelings are completely valid," he said softly. "Fibromyalgia is one of the most challenging conditions I treat, and you've been dealing with a particularly severe case. But I need you to understand that we're making progress, even if it doesn't feel that way." He pulled out my chart and began reviewing the past 4 years of treatment, pointing to various lab results and symptom assessments that he claimed showed improvement. To my eyes, the numbers looked largely unchanged, but he interpreted them as signs of stabilization and gradual progress. "Without the treatments we've been pursuing, your condition would likely be much worse," he explained. "Fibromyalgia is a progressive condition in many patients, and the fact that we've been able to prevent significant deterioration is actually a success, even though it may not feel like one." He went on to describe a new treatment protocol he had been researching, a combination of high-dose intravenous immunoglobulin therapy and experimental peptide injections that had shown promise in treating severe fibromyalgia cases. The treatment would require twice-weekly visits to his clinic for several months and would cost approximately $8,000 per month, though he was confident we could work with insurance and pharmaceutical companies to make it affordable. "I know this feels overwhelming," he said, "but I truly believe this could be the breakthrough we've been working toward. I've seen remarkable results with this protocol in other patients with cases similar to yours." As he described the new treatment, I felt a familiar mixture of hope and desperation. Part of me wanted to believe that this time would be different, that this new protocol would finally provide the relief I had been seeking for 4 years. But another part of me, a part that was growing stronger despite the medication fog, wondered why I needed increasingly complex and expensive treatments when nothing had worked so far. That night, lying in bed surrounded by pill bottles and medical equipment, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to seek a second opinion, regardless of what Dr. Hartwell thought about it. I had been a successful, intelligent woman before this illness, and I needed to trust my instincts that something wasn't right about my treatment. The next morning, I called my college roommate Sarah, who had become a nurse practitioner specializing in internal medicine. We hadn't spoken much over the past few years. My illness had made me withdraw from most of my friendships, but she had always been someone I could trust for honest advice. "Martha, I've been worried about you," Sarah said when I called. "From what you've told me about your treatments, something doesn't sound right. Fibromyalgia is a real condition, but the medication regimen you're describing is more complex than what I typically see, even in severe cases." She recommended a colleague, Dr. Jennifer Chun, who practiced integrative medicine and had experience treating complex chronic conditions. Dr. Chun was known for taking a comprehensive approach to diagnosis and treatment, looking at the whole person rather than just prescribing medications for symptoms. "I think you should see her," Sarah said. "At minimum, she can review your case and confirm that you're on the right track. But Martha, I have to be honest, some of the medications you're taking are concerning, especially in combination. I think you need a fresh perspective on your case." Making the appointment with Dr. Chin felt like a betrayal of Dr. Hartwell, who had invested so much time and effort in my care. But I was desperate enough to try anything, and the small voice in my head that questioned my treatment had grown too loud to ignore. Dr. Chen's office was a stark contrast to Dr. Hartwell's luxurious medical center. Located in a modest building near the University Medical Center, her waiting room was simple but warm, with natural lighting and plants that created a calming atmosphere. The other patients didn't look as sick and defeated as the ones in Dr. Hartwell's office, and many seemed to be engaged in normal activities like reading or working on laptops while they waited. When Dr. Chen entered the examination room, I was immediately struck by the difference in her approach. She spent the first 30 minutes simply listening to my story, asking detailed questions about my symptoms, my medical history, and my life before I became ill. She seemed particularly interested in the timeline of my illness and the progression of my treatments. "Tell me about your life before you started experiencing these symptoms," she said. "What was your energy level like? What activities did you enjoy? Had you experienced any significant stresses or life changes in the months before your symptoms began?" As I described my life before illness, my successful career, my active social life, my love of hiking and travel, I realized how much I had lost over the past 4 years. Dr. Chen listened intently, occasionally taking notes, but mostly just giving me her full attention in a way that felt different from my appointments with Dr. Hartwell. When she began her physical examination, she was thorough but gentle, explaining what she was looking for and why. She spent considerable time examining my joints, checking for swelling and range of motion, and testing my reflexes and muscle strength. "I'd like to run some blood work," she said after completing her examination. "I want to look at some markers that might not have been checked recently, including tests for Lyme disease, autoimmune conditions, and nutritional deficiencies." The mention of Lyme disease caught my attention. "Dr. Hartwell tested for that early on," I said. "It was negative. The standard Lyme tests can miss a significant percentage of cases," Dr. Chen explained. "I'd like to run more comprehensive testing, including some specialized labs that are more sensitive for detecting chronic Lyme disease." She also wanted to review all of my medications and their interactions, expressing concern about the complexity of my current regimen. "Some of these medications can actually worsen fatigue and cognitive function, especially when used in combination," she said. "I'd like to work with you to gradually simplify your medication regimen while we investigate other possible causes for your symptoms." For the first time in 4 years, I felt like a doctor was actually listening to me and considering that my symptoms might have a different cause than fibromyalgia. Dr. Chen's approach felt collaborative rather than authoritative, and she seemed genuinely interested in helping me get better rather than just managing my symptoms. As I left her office with orders for blood work and a plan to return in 2 weeks, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the desperate hope that came with each new medication Dr. Hartwell prescribed, but a calm, rational hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a different explanation for my illness and a path toward actual recovery. I had no idea that this appointment would be the beginning of the end for Dr. Hartwell's carefully constructed house of cards. 2 weeks later, I sat in Dr. Chen's office staring at test results that would change everything I thought I knew about my illness. The comprehensive blood work she had ordered told a story that was completely different from the fibromyalgia narrative I had been living with for 4 years. "Martha, I have some significant findings to discuss with you," Dr. Chen said, spreading the lab reports across her desk. "The most important result is that you tested positive for Lyme disease. Not just the standard test, but multiple confirmatory tests that indicate you have an active chronic infection." I stared at the papers in disbelief. "But Dr. Hartwell tested for Lyme disease when I first became ill. He said it was negative. The standard ELISA test that most doctors use misses about 50% of Lyme cases," Dr. Chen explained. "I ran more specialized testing through a lab that specializes in tick-borne diseases. Your results show clear evidence of Borrelia burgdorferi infection, along with 2 co-infections that commonly occur with Lyme disease." She went on to explain that many of my symptoms, the fatigue, joint pain, cognitive issues, and neurological problems, were classic presentations of chronic Lyme disease. The condition was notoriously difficult to diagnose using standard tests, which explained why it had been missed for so long. "The tragedy is that if this had been caught early, it could have been treated with a simple course of antibiotics," Dr. Chen said. "Now that it's become chronic, treatment will be more complex, but you should see significant improvement with appropriate therapy." I felt a mixture of relief and rage washing over me. Relief that there was finally an explanation for my suffering and a real path toward recovery. Rage that I had spent 4 years being treated for the wrong condition, taking medications that not only didn't help but actually made me worse. "What about all the medications I'm taking?" I asked. "Were they necessary?" Dr. Chen's expression grew serious. "Martha, I need to be honest with you. Many of the medications you're currently taking are not only unnecessary for your actual condition, but some of them may have been making your symptoms worse. Several of the drugs in your regimen can cause fatigue, cognitive impairment, and immune suppression, all of which would worsen Lyme disease. She began reviewing my medication list, explaining how each drug might have contributed to my declining health. The opioids had likely worsened my fatigue and cognitive function. The immunosuppressive medications had prevented my body from fighting the Lyme infection. The anticonvulsants had caused memory problems and mood changes that mimicked Lyme symptoms. It's as if you've been taking medications that were designed to keep you sick rather than make you better, she said. The implications of her words hit me like a physical blow. For 4 years, I had trusted Dr. Hartwell completely, believing that he was doing everything possible to help me recover. Now I was learning that his treatments had not only been ineffective, but actively harmful. I need to ask you something, Dr. Chen said carefully. Have you ever questioned why Dr. Hartwell kept adding more and more expensive medications when you weren't getting better? The question hung in the air between us. I had questioned it many times, but I had always dismissed my doubts because of Dr. Hartwell's credentials and confidence. Now, with the truth about my actual diagnosis staring me in the face, those doubts came flooding back with devastating clarity. I trusted him, I said quietly. He's supposed to be one of the best rheumatologists in the city. I'm sure he is skilled in his field, Dr. Chen said diplomatically. But I think you should know that some of the medications he prescribed for you are very expensive, and pharmaceutical companies often provide financial incentives to doctors who prescribe their products frequently. She explained that while such arrangements weren't necessarily illegal, they could create conflicts of interest that might influence treatment decisions. She suggested that I might want to research Dr. Hartwell's financial relationships with pharmaceutical companies, information that was publicly available through various databases. That evening, I sat at my computer for the first time in months, my mind clearer than it had been in years as I began to research Dr. Hartwell's connections to the pharmaceutical industry. What I found made me physically sick. The Open Payments database, maintained by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, revealed that Dr. Hartwell had received over $300,000 in payments from pharmaceutical companies over the past 5 years. The payments were categorized as speaking fees, consulting payments, research grants, and travel expenses, but they all came from companies that manufactured the expensive medications he had been prescribing to me. The largest payments came from the manufacturers of Savella, Nicinta, Benlysta, and the other expensive drugs that had formed the backbone of my treatment regimen. Dr. Hartwell had received speaking fees for promoting these medications at medical conferences, consulting payments for advising on their marketing strategies, and research grants for conducting studies on their effectiveness. As I dug deeper, I discovered that Dr. Hartwell was part of a network of physicians who were known in the industry as key opinion leaders, doctors who were paid to influence other physicians to prescribe specific medications. He had given dozens of presentations at medical conferences, authored articles in medical journals, and participated in advisory boards, all while being paid by the companies whose products he was promoting. The pattern was clear and damning. Every expensive medication Dr. Hartwell had prescribed for me corresponded to payments he had received from that drug's manufacturer. The timing of when he introduced new medications to my regimen aligned perfectly with when he had received speaking fees or consulting payments from those companies. I felt like I was going to vomit as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Dr. Hartwell hadn't been treating me. He had been using me as a source of income, prescribing expensive medications not because I needed them, but because he was being paid to promote them. My suffering, my financial ruin, my lost years, all of it had been for his profit. But the most sickening realization was that I wasn't alone. If Dr. Hartwell was doing this to me, he was likely doing it to other patients as well. The waiting room full of sick, defeated-looking people suddenly made sense. They weren't just fibromyalgia patients struggling with a difficult condition. They were victims of a systematic scheme to keep patients sick and dependent on expensive medications. As I sat in my apartment surrounded by the evidence of Dr. Hartwell's corruption, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I wasn't just going to get better and move on. I was going to expose Dr. Hartwell and make sure he paid for what he had done to me and countless other patients. The marketing executive in me, the person I had been before Dr. Hartwell destroyed my life, began to emerge from the medication fog. I knew how to research, how to document evidence, and how to build a case. And I was going to use every skill I had ever learned to bring down the man who had stolen 4 years of my life for profit. Dr. Hartwell had made a crucial mistake when he chose me as one of his victims. He had underestimated my intelligence, my determination, and my capacity for revenge. He was about to learn that some patients fight back. The first step in my investigation was to systematically document everything about my treatment under Dr. Hartwell. I requested copies of all my medical records, prescription histories, and billing statements from his office. Initially, his staff was cooperative, assuming I needed the records for insurance purposes or to share with other healthcare providers. As I reviewed 4 years of medical documentation, patterns emerged that were even more disturbing than I had initially realized. Dr. Hartwell's notes consistently described my condition as severe and treatment-resistant, justifying the need for increasingly aggressive and expensive interventions. However, his objective findings, vital signs, physical examination results, and lab values, remained largely unchanged throughout my treatment. More telling were the timing patterns I discovered. New medications were invariably introduced shortly after Dr. Hartwell had attended pharmaceutical company conferences or received consulting payments. His notes would suddenly include references to new research or breakthrough treatments that coincided perfectly with his financial relationships with specific drug manufacturers. I also noticed that Dr. Hartwell had been conducting research studies on many of the medications he prescribed to me. These studies, funded by pharmaceutical companies, allowed him to prescribe experimental or off-label medications while receiving additional payments for patient enrollment and data collection. I had unknowingly been a research subject in multiple studies, generating income for Dr. Hartwell while receiving treatments that were making me sicker. My next step was to investigate Dr. Hartwell's other patients. This proved more challenging, as patient information is protected by privacy laws, but I found creative ways to gather intelligence. I began spending time in Dr. Hartwell's waiting room, striking up conversations with other patients about their experiences and treatments. What I discovered was a pattern of remarkably similar stories. Patient after patient described years of treatment with complex medication regimens, escalating costs, and worsening symptoms. Many had been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, or other difficult-to-diagnose conditions that required long-term pharmaceutical management. I met Sarah, a 45-year-old teacher who had been Dr. Hartwell's patient for 6 years. She was taking 14 different medications for fibromyalgia and had spent over $100,000 on treatments that had left her unable to work and barely able to function. Like me, she had never questioned Dr. Hartwell's expertise, trusting that his aggressive treatment approach was necessary for her complex condition. There was Michael, a 38-year-old construction worker who had been diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome after a workplace injury. Dr. Hartwell had prescribed a regimen of expensive biologics and experimental treatments that had bankrupted Michael's family while providing no improvement in his symptoms. Michael's wife had left him, unable to cope with the financial strain and his deteriorating condition. And there was Elena, a 52-year-old nurse who should have known better but had been manipulated just as effectively as the rest of us. Dr. Hartwell had convinced her that her symptoms represented a rare autoimmune condition requiring cutting-edge treatments available only through his practice. Elena had mortgaged her house to pay for treatments and was facing foreclosure. Each story followed the same pattern. Initial symptoms that could have multiple causes, a quick diagnosis of a chronic condition requiring long-term pharmaceutical management, escalating medication regimens with expensive drugs, worsening symptoms attributed to disease progression, and financial devastation from the cost of treatments. As I gathered these stories, I began to understand the scope of Dr. Hartwell's operation. He wasn't just a doctor who had made some questionable prescribing decisions. He was running a systematic scheme to defraud patients and insurance companies while enriching himself through pharmaceutical kickbacks. I decided to take my investigation to the next level by researching Dr. Hartwell's professional history and business relationships. What I found painted a picture of a physician who had gradually transformed from a legitimate medical practitioner into something much more sinister. Dr. Hartwell had started his career as a respected rheumatologist with a traditional practice focused on treating arthritis and autoimmune conditions. However, about 8 years ago, his practice had undergone a dramatic transformation. He had begun specializing in complex chronic conditions, and had started his own research institute focused on fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. The timing of this transformation coincided with his first major pharmaceutical consulting contracts. As his income from drug companies increased, his practice had evolved to focus almost exclusively on conditions that required expensive long-term pharmaceutical management. He had stopped treating traditional rheumatologic conditions like rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, which had established treatment protocols that didn't generate as much revenue. I discovered that Dr. Hartwell had also established financial relationships with several specialty pharmacies that filled prescriptions for expensive medications. These pharmacies paid him consulting fees and provided kickbacks for patient referrals, creating additional revenue streams from the same patients he was treating. Most disturbing of all, I found evidence that Dr. Hartwell had been deliberately targeting vulnerable patient populations. His marketing efforts focused on support groups for chronic illness, online forums for people with unexplained symptoms, and referral relationships with primary care physicians who were frustrated with difficult-to-diagnose cases. He had positioned himself as a specialist who could help patients that other doctors had given up on, attracting desperate people who were willing to try anything to get better. These patients were perfect victims for his scheme. They were already sick, financially motivated to find answers, and unlikely to question aggressive treatment approaches. As my investigation progressed, I began documenting everything meticulously. I created spreadsheets tracking Dr. Hartwell's pharmaceutical payments and correlating them with his prescribing patterns. I recorded conversations with other patients, with their permission, and gathered copies of their medical records and billing statements. I researched the medications he commonly prescribed, documenting their costs, side effects, and appropriate uses. The evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Hartwell had been systematically misdiagnosing patients and prescribing unnecessary, expensive medications in exchange for pharmaceutical company payments. He had been conducting unethical research studies using patients as unwitting subjects. He had been defrauding insurance companies by billing for unnecessary treatments and procedures. But I knew that having evidence wasn't enough. I needed to find a way to expose Dr. Hartwell's crimes and ensure that he faced consequences for his actions. I also wanted to help his other victims and prevent him from harming additional patients. My first step was to file complaints with the appropriate regulatory bodies. I submitted detailed reports to the state medical board, documenting Dr. Hartwell's financial conflicts of interest and inappropriate prescribing patterns. I filed complaints with the Drug Enforcement Administration regarding his opioid prescribing practices and with the Office of Inspector General regarding potential Medicare fraud. I also contacted investigative journalists who specialized in healthcare fraud, providing them with documentation of Dr. Hartwell's scheme and connecting them with other victims who were willing to share their stories. I knew that media attention would be crucial for exposing the full scope of his operation and preventing him from simply moving to another state or changing his practice. Meanwhile, I had begun working with Dr. Chen to treat my actual condition. The Lyme disease treatment was challenging. The infection had become deeply entrenched after years of misdiagnosis, but I was finally seeing real improvement in my symptoms. As the unnecessary medications were gradually discontinued and appropriate antibiotics were started, my energy began to return, my cognitive function improved, and my pain decreased. The contrast between Dr. Chen's approach and Dr. Hartwell's was stark. Dr. Chen used the minimum number of medications necessary to treat my condition, focused on supporting my body's natural healing processes, and regularly reassessed my treatment plan based on my response. Her goal was to get me better and eventually off medications entirely, not to keep me dependent on expensive drugs indefinitely. As my health improved, my determination to expose Dr. Hartwell only grew stronger. I was getting my life back, but I knew that dozens of other patients were still trapped in his web of deception and exploitation. They deserved to know the truth about their treatment, and Dr. Hartwell deserved to face justice for his crimes. The investigation I had started as a desperate search for answers had evolved into something much larger, a mission to expose one of the most sophisticated medical fraud schemes I had ever encountered. And I was just getting started. 6 months into my investigation, I had assembled a case against Dr. Hartwell that was more damning than I had ever imagined possible. What had started as suspicions about inappropriate prescribing had revealed a complex criminal enterprise involving multiple physicians, pharmaceutical companies, specialty pharmacies, and research organizations. The breakthrough came when I connected with Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a former colleague of Dr. Hartwell's who had left his practice 3 years earlier. Dr. Rodriguez had grown uncomfortable with the direction of Dr. Hartwell's practice and had tried to raise concerns internally before ultimately resigning. She had been afraid to speak out publicly, fearing retaliation and damage to her own career, but my investigation gave her the courage to come forward. I watched Marcus transform from a competent physician into something I didn't recognize, Dr. Rodriguez told me during a recorded interview. The pharmaceutical money changed everything. He stopped caring about patient outcomes and became obsessed with prescribing the most expensive medications possible. Dr. Rodriguez provided insider details about how Dr. Hartwell's scheme operated. She described staff meetings where pharmaceutical representatives would present new products and discuss patient identification strategies, essentially teaching the staff how to identify patients who would be good candidates for expensive medications regardless of their actual medical needs. She revealed that Dr. Hartwell had established quotas for prescribing specific medications, with bonuses for staff members who helped achieve prescribing targets. The practice had hired patient coordinators, whose job was to convince patients to try new medications and to help them navigate insurance approval processes for expensive treatments. Most shocking of all, Dr. Rodriguez disclosed that Dr. Hartwell had been deliberately prolonging patient illnesses to maintain revenue streams. When patients showed signs of improvement, he would often add new medications or change diagnoses to justify continued treatment. He had explicitly told staff that cured patients don't generate revenue. Armed with Dr. Rodriguez's testimony and my own extensive documentation, I approached the FBI's healthcare fraud unit. The special agent assigned to my case, Agent Sarah Mitchell, was initially skeptical. Healthcare fraud cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute, and pharmaceutical company payments to physicians were often legal even if ethically questionable. However, as Agent Mitchell reviewed my evidence, her skepticism turned to alarm. The scope and sophistication of Dr. Hartwell's operation went far beyond typical pharmaceutical marketing relationships. He had been systematically defrauding patients and insurance companies while conducting unethical human experimentation. "This is one of the most comprehensive healthcare fraud schemes I've seen," Agent Mitchell told me. Dr. Hartwell wasn't just accepting pharmaceutical money. He was running a criminal enterprise designed to exploit vulnerable patients for profit. The FBI launched a full investigation, obtaining search warrants for Dr. Hartwell's offices, financial records, and communications with pharmaceutical companies. They also began investigating the other physicians in his network and the companies that had been paying him. Meanwhile, my story had attracted national media attention. Investigative journalists from major newspapers and television networks had picked up the story, conducting their own investigations into Dr. Hartwell's practices and the broader issue of pharmaceutical company influence on medical decision-making. The media coverage had an immediate impact on Dr. Hartwell's practice. Patients began canceling appointments and demanding second opinions. Several pharmaceutical companies suspended their relationships with him pending the outcome of the investigation. His malpractice insurance carrier launched their own investigation and threatened to cancel his coverage. But Dr. Hartwell wasn't going down without a fight. He hired an expensive legal team and began a campaign to discredit me and the other patients who had come forward. His lawyers claimed that I was a disgruntled patient seeking financial gain, and that my allegations were motivated by anger over my medical condition rather than legitimate concerns about his treatment. Dr. Hartwell also attempted to use his professional connections to pressure other physicians not to cooperate with the investigation. He reached out to medical colleagues, pharmaceutical company contacts, and professional organizations, claiming that the investigation was a witch hunt that threatened all physicians who worked with pharmaceutical companies. His efforts to intimidate witnesses backfired spectacularly. Several physicians who had been reluctant to speak out became angry about his attempts to silence them and decided to cooperate with investigators. Pharmaceutical company executives, concerned about their own legal exposure, began distancing themselves from Dr. Hartwell and providing information about their relationships with him. The investigation also revealed that Dr. Hartwell's scheme had international connections. He had been collaborating with physicians in other countries to conduct research studies that would have been illegal in the United States. These studies involved testing experimental medications on patients without proper informed consent and falsifying data to support pharmaceutical company marketing claims. As the evidence mounted, Dr. Hartwell's legal situation became increasingly desperate. The FBI had documented systematic fraud involving millions of dollars in unnecessary medical treatments, insurance fraud, research misconduct, and violations of federal drug laws. The case had grown from a simple malpractice issue into a complex federal criminal investigation. The state medical board moved quickly to suspend Dr. Hartwell's license, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. His practice was forced to close, and his assets were frozen to prevent him from hiding money or fleeing the country. The pharmaceutical companies that had been paying him faced their own investigations and potential criminal charges. For me, watching Dr. Hartwell's empire crumble was deeply satisfying, but also bittersweet. I was finally seeing justice for the years of suffering he had caused me and countless other patients. But I also knew that the damage he had done couldn't be easily undone. Patients like me would need years to recover from the unnecessary treatments we had endured, and some might never fully recover. The financial devastation was equally difficult to address. While I hoped to recover some of my losses through civil litigation, the reality was that many of Dr. Hartwell's victims had lost their life savings and would never be fully compensated for their suffering. But there was also hope. As news of the investigation spread, other patients who had been trapped in similar schemes began coming forward. Medical boards in other states launched their own investigations into physicians with suspicious prescribing patterns and pharmaceutical company relationships. The case was sparking a broader conversation about the need for reform in how pharmaceutical companies interact with physicians. Most importantly for me, I was getting my life back. The Lyme disease treatment was working, and I was gradually returning to the person I had been before Dr. Hartwell destroyed my health. I had found a new purpose in exposing medical fraud and helping other patients who had been victimized by corrupt physicians. The investigation that had started as a desperate search for answers had become something much larger, a catalyst for systemic change in how medical fraud is detected and prosecuted. And Dr. Hartwell, the man who had thought he could exploit vulnerable patients with impunity, was about to learn that some victims refused to stay silent. The federal courthouse was packed on the morning of Dr. Hartwell's sentencing hearing. I sat in the front row with other victims, many of whom I had helped identify during the investigation. After 18 months of legal proceedings, we were finally going to see justice served. The case against Dr. Hartwell had grown far beyond what any of us had initially imagined. Federal prosecutors had charged him with healthcare fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and conducting illegal human experiments. The evidence presented during his trial painted a picture of a physician who had completely abandoned his oath to do no harm in pursuit of pharmaceutical company profits. The prosecution had documented that Dr. Hartwell had received over $2.3 million in payments from pharmaceutical companies over a 7-year period. In exchange, he had prescribed unnecessary medications to more than 800 patients, generating over $15 million in fraudulent insurance claims. His victims had suffered not just financially, but physically and emotionally from years of inappropriate treatments. During the trial, dozens of patients had testified about their experiences under Dr. Hartwell's care. Sarah, the teacher who had been taking 14 medications, described how she had lost her career and nearly lost her marriage due to the side effects of unnecessary treatments. Michael, the construction worker, testified about the financial devastation that had destroyed his family. Elena, the nurse, broke down on the witness stand as she described how a trusted colleague had exploited her medical knowledge to manipulate her into accepting harmful treatments. My own testimony had been particularly powerful because of the extensive documentation I had gathered. I was able to present a detailed timeline showing how Dr. Hartwell's prescribing decisions correlated directly with his pharmaceutical company payments. The jury could see clearly how my treatment had been driven by profit rather than medical necessity. The defense had tried to argue that Dr. Hartwell was simply an aggressive physician who was trying to help patients with difficult conditions. They claimed that his pharmaceutical company relationships were legitimate and that any treatment failures were due to the complexity of the conditions he was treating rather than inappropriate care. But the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution had obtained internal communications between Dr. Hartwell and pharmaceutical companies that explicitly discussed strategies for increasing prescribing volumes. They had documented cases where he had changed diagnoses to justify expensive medications and had falsified research data to support pharmaceutical company marketing claims. Perhaps most damning was testimony from Dr. Rodriguez and other former staff members who described the internal culture of Dr. Hartwell's practice. They painted a picture of an organization that had been completely corrupted by pharmaceutical money, where patient care decisions were made based on revenue potential rather than medical need. The jury had deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Dr. Hartwell had shown no emotion as the verdicts were read, but his family members in the courtroom had broken down in tears. Now, 3 months later, we were gathered for his sentencing. Federal prosecutors were seeking a 20-year prison sentence, arguing that Dr. Hartwell's crimes represented one of the most serious breaches of medical ethics they had ever prosecuted. The defense was asking for leniency, claiming that Dr. Hartwell had already been punished enough through the loss of his medical license and the destruction of his reputation. Judge Patricia Williams had a reputation for being tough on white-collar criminals, particularly those who had exploited vulnerable victims. As she prepared to announce Dr. Hartwell's sentence, the courtroom fell silent. "Dr. Hartwell," Judge Williams began, "you have been convicted of crimes that strike at the very heart of the doctor-patient relationship. Patients trusted you with their health, their financial resources, and their hope for recovery. You betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible." She went on to describe the impact of his crimes on individual victims and on the broader healthcare system. "Your actions have not only harmed the patients under your direct care, but have damaged public trust in the medical profession as a whole. When physicians prioritize profit over patient welfare, they undermine the foundation of medical ethics that protects us all." Judge Williams sentenced Dr. Hartwell to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. She also ordered him to pay $12.8 million in restitution to his victims and to forfeit all assets that had been obtained through his criminal activities. "I hope this sentence sends a clear message that healthcare fraud will not be tolerated," Judge Williams said. "Physicians who exploit their patients for financial gain will face the full consequences of their actions." As Dr. Hartwell was led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing him finally held accountable for his crimes, but also sadness for all the suffering that could have been prevented if his scheme had been detected earlier. The sentencing was just the beginning of the broader consequences of the investigation. Several pharmaceutical companies had agreed to pay substantial fines and had implemented new compliance programs to prevent similar schemes in the future. The FDA had strengthened regulations governing physician-pharmaceutical company relationships, and medical boards across the country had enhanced their monitoring of suspicious prescribing patterns. Most importantly, the case had sparked a national conversation about the need for transparency in medical decision-making. Patients were becoming more aware of potential conflicts of interest and were asking more questions about their treatments. Medical schools were incorporating more training on ethics and the appropriate relationship between physicians and pharmaceutical companies. For me personally, the conclusion of the criminal case marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life. My health had continued to improve under Dr. Chen's care, and I was finally free from the fog of unnecessary medications that had clouded my thinking for so many years. I had returned to work part-time and was slowly rebuilding the financial security that Dr. Hartwell's treatments had destroyed. But perhaps most significantly, I had found a new purpose in life. The investigation had revealed my talent for research and advocacy, and I had decided to dedicate myself to helping other victims of medical fraud. I was working with patient advocacy organizations to develop resources for identifying and reporting suspicious medical practices, and I was consulting with law enforcement agencies on healthcare fraud investigations. The civil lawsuits against Dr. Hartwell and the pharmaceutical companies were still pending, but I was optimistic that we would eventually recover at least some of the financial losses his victims had suffered. More importantly, the legal precedents established by the criminal case would make it easier to prosecute similar schemes in the future. As I left the courthouse that day, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. For years earlier, I had been a trusting patient who had never questioned my doctor's recommendations. The experience of being victimized by Dr. Hartwell had been devastating, but it had also revealed strengths I never knew I possessed. I had learned that patients have more power than they realize to investigate their own care and to hold physicians accountable for their actions. I had discovered that even the most sophisticated fraud schemes can be exposed by determined individuals who are willing to ask difficult questions and document evidence carefully. Most importantly, I had proven that victims of medical fraud don't have to suffer in silence. By speaking out and fighting back, we can not only seek justice for ourselves but also protect other patients from similar exploitation. Dr. Hartwell had thought he could exploit vulnerable patients with impunity, hiding behind his medical degree and prestigious credentials. He had underestimated the intelligence and determination of his victims, particularly mine. His downfall proved that no one, regardless of their professional status, is above the law when they choose to harm others for personal gain. The months following Dr. Hartwell's sentencing brought unexpected developments that extended the impact of our case far beyond what any of us had anticipated. What had started as my personal quest for justice had evolved into a catalyst for systemic change in healthcare fraud detection and prevention. The first major development came when the Department of Justice announced the creation of a new healthcare fraud strike force specifically focused on physician-pharmaceutical company corruption schemes. Our case had demonstrated that traditional healthcare fraud investigations often missed sophisticated schemes that involved legitimate medications prescribed inappropriately rather than obviously fraudulent billing. Agent Mitchell, who had led the FBI investigation into Dr. Hartwell, was promoted to head the new strike force. She contacted me to serve as a consultant, helping to train investigators on how to identify the warning signs of pharmaceutical kickback schemes and how to build cases against corrupt physicians. Your investigation showed us that patients can be our best allies in detecting healthcare fraud, Agent Mitchell told me. You identified patterns and gathered evidence that would have taken us years to discover through traditional investigative methods. The training program we developed focused on teaching investigators how to analyze pharmaceutical payment data, how to identify suspicious prescribing patterns, and how to interview victims of medical fraud. We also created resources for patients to help them recognize potential red flags in their own medical care. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical companies that had been paying Dr. Hartwell were facing their own consequences. 3 major drug manufacturers had agreed to pay a combined $180 million in fines and had entered into corporate integrity agreements that required them to implement strict compliance programs. The most significant settlement came from Meridian Pharmaceuticals, the manufacturer of several expensive medications that Dr. Hartwell had been aggressively prescribing. Internal documents obtained during the investigation revealed that Meridian executives had known about Dr. Hartwell's inappropriate prescribing patterns, but had continued to pay him because he was generating substantial revenue for their products. We deeply regret that our relationship with Dr. Hartwell may have contributed to inappropriate patient care, Meridian CEO said in a statement announcing their settlement. We are committed to ensuring that our interactions with healthcare providers always prioritize patient welfare over commercial interests. The settlement funds were used to establish a victim compensation program that provided additional financial support to Dr. Hartwell's patients beyond the restitution ordered by the court. While no amount of money could fully compensate for the suffering we had endured, the payments helped many victims rebuild their lives and access appropriate medical care. The case also sparked legislative action at both the state and federal levels. Congress passed the Medical Transparency Act, which required pharmaceutical companies to report all payments to physicians in real time and made this information easily accessible to patients through a searchable online database. Several states implemented new regulations requiring physicians to disclose their pharmaceutical company relationships to patients before prescribing medications. Medical boards were given additional resources to monitor physician prescribing patterns and investigate potential conflicts of interest. Perhaps most importantly, medical schools across the country began incorporating more comprehensive training on ethics and the appropriate relationship between physicians and pharmaceutical companies. The case had highlighted how even well-trained physicians could be corrupted by financial incentives, leading to calls for better education on recognizing and avoiding conflicts of interest. Dr. Chun, who had played such a crucial role in exposing Dr. Hartwell's scheme by correctly diagnosing my Lyme disease, became a prominent advocate for diagnostic accuracy and patient-centered care. She was invited to speak at medical conferences about the importance of thorough evaluation and the dangers of premature diagnostic closure. The Martha Thompson case demonstrates how financial incentives can distort medical decision-making, Dr. Chun would tell audiences. When physicians are paid to prescribe specific medications, they may unconsciously bias their diagnostic thinking toward conditions that require those treatments. She also emphasized the importance of listening to patients and considering alternative diagnoses when treatments aren't working. If a patient isn't improving with treatment, we need to question our diagnosis, not just add more medications, she would say. The media attention surrounding the case had also led to the discovery of similar schemes in other parts of the country. Investigative journalists had used our case as a template for investigating suspicious physicians in their own regions, leading to additional prosecutions and the exposure of a nationwide network of corrupt healthcare providers. One particularly significant case emerged in Texas, where a pain management physician had been running a scheme similar to Dr. Hartwell's, but focused on opioid medications. The investigation, inspired by our case, revealed that the physician had been deliberately creating opioid addiction in patients to maintain long-term prescribing relationships while receiving payments from pharmaceutical companies. The Texas case led to additional federal legislation specifically targeting opioid prescribing fraud and strengthened penalties for physicians who contributed to the opioid epidemic for financial gain. It also resulted in new monitoring systems that could detect suspicious opioid prescribing patterns in real time. For the other victims of Dr. Hartwell's scheme, the aftermath of the case brought mixed results. Many, like me, were able to receive appropriate treatment for their actual medical conditions and experience significant improvement in their health. Sarah, the teacher, was eventually able to return to work after being properly treated for an autoimmune condition that had been misdiagnosed as fibromyalgia. Michael, the construction worker, discovered that his symptoms were largely due to a workplace chemical exposure that had never been properly investigated. With appropriate treatment and removal from the toxic environment, his health improved dramatically, and he was able to return to work and rebuild his relationship with his family. Elena, the nurse, had perhaps the most dramatic recovery. Her symptoms were ultimately traced to a vitamin B12 deficiency that could have been easily treated with simple supplements. The expensive biologics and immunosuppressive medications Dr. Hartwell had prescribed had actually worsened her condition by interfering with her body's ability to absorb nutrients. However, not all of Dr. Hartwell's victims were as fortunate. Some had suffered permanent damage from years of inappropriate treatments, particularly those who had been given immunosuppressive medications that had allowed underlying infections to progress unchecked. Several patients had developed serious complications from the medications themselves, including liver damage, kidney problems, and neurological issues. The psychological trauma was equally significant for many victims. The betrayal of trust by a healthcare provider had left many patients afraid to seek medical care or unable to trust new physicians. Support groups were established to help victims process their experiences and learn to navigate the healthcare system safely. As I reflected on the 2 years that had passed since I first walked into Dr. Chen's office seeking a second opinion, I was amazed by how much had changed. What had started as a desperate attempt to understand my own illness had evolved into a movement that was transforming how healthcare fraud is detected and prevented. The personal cost had been enormous: years of suffering, financial devastation, and the loss of trust in the medical system that was supposed to protect me. But the outcome had been worth the struggle. Dr. Hartwell was in prison, his victims were receiving justice, and systemic changes were being implemented to prevent similar schemes in the future. Most importantly, I had discovered that individual patients have far more power than they realize to hold the healthcare system accountable. By asking questions, demanding transparency, and refusing to accept inadequate care, patients can protect themselves and others from exploitation. The case had also taught me that corruption in healthcare is not just a financial crime. It's a betrayal of the fundamental trust that makes medical care possible. When physicians prioritize profit over patient welfare, they damage not just their individual victims, but the entire healthcare system. As I prepared to testify before Congress about the need for additional healthcare fraud prevention measures, I thought about all the patients who were still trapped in schemes similar to Dr. Hartwell's. My work was far from over, but I was confident that the changes we had set in motion would help protect future patients from the kind of exploitation I had endured. The fight against medical corruption would continue, but Dr. Hartwell's downfall had proven that even the most sophisticated fraud schemes could be exposed by determined patients who refused to remain silent. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the system was changing to prevent future victims. If my story has taught you anything, it should be this: you have more power as a patient than you realize, and you should never be afraid to question your medical care. Dr. Hartwell thought he could hide behind his credentials and exploit vulnerable patients indefinitely, but he underestimated the determination of someone who refused to accept that suffering was inevitable. Today, I'm healthier than I've been in years. Dr. Hartwell is serving an 18-year prison sentence, and the healthcare system has implemented new protections to prevent similar schemes. But there are still corrupt physicians out there, still patients being exploited, and still people who need to hear this message. You don't have to suffer in silence. If something doesn't feel right about your medical care, trust your instincts. Research your medications, look up your doctor's pharmaceutical company relationships, and never be afraid to seek a second opinion. Your life might depend on it. The fight against medical corruption continues, and every person who watches this video and shares the story helps protect other patients from exploitation. If this story resonated with you, if it opened your eyes to the reality of healthcare fraud, or if it gave you the courage to question your own medical care, then please hit that subscribe button and share this video with others who need to hear this message. Together, we can hold the healthcare system accountable and ensure that no other patient has to endure what I went through. Your voice matters, your questions matter, and your willingness to fight back can make all the difference. Subscribe now, and let's continue this fight for patient rights and medical transparency together. Because when patients stand up and demand better, the entire system has to listen.